Hi, welcome to Millions and Killing Capitalism. This is Josh. In this episode that was originally recorded in late June, I speak with Mary Turfa about a couple of her recently released articles. We discuss the broader context of medical neutrality and the targeting of healthcare workers in Gaza. Mary Turfa explains how the concept of medical neutrality has racialized limitations, particularly in the colonial context, where oppressor nations often do not need the medical facilities of the colonized and thus feel justified in targeting them. Turfa highlights how the systematic targeting of healthcare workers in Gaza by Israeli forces, noting that nearly 500 healthcare workers have been killed as of May 15th, often through targeted bombings or summary executions. She emphasized that this targeting is part of a broader strategy to control the Palestinian population by eliminating those who can provide life-saving care. The strategy not only cripples the current medical infrastructure, but also undermines the future training and development of medical professionals in Gaza. This interview also touches on the personal experiences of healthcare workers in Gaza, who often have to change out of their scrubs to avoid being targeted and face abductions and other forms of violence. Turfa concludes by reflecting on her own experiences as a surgical resident, offers critiques of healthcare, specifically in the U.S., and the broader implications for medical professionals working in conflict zones. Mary Turfa is a writer and a resident physician trained in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African studies. Her research focused primarily on trauma memory and the margins of the Nakba. She has written about medical neutrality and subtle psychosis for the Baffler, the misuses of Eber Said's famous permission to narrate for Protein, the destruction of medical infrastructure in Gaza for the nation, and other things for other places. She's working on an essay collection about medicine and imperialism, explored through the life of a Lebanese LBGYN who inspired her to pursue medicine. If you like what we do and want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as little as $1 a month. We bring you these conversations totally independently with no corporate, state, or grant funding. Now, here is Mary Turfa discussing some of her work. Okay, so I'm here today with Mary Turfa, and we're discussing a couple of her articles, beginning with the recently released article published in the Baffler titled Running Amok, the Fees of IDF Depict What Zionists Can't See. And in that article, you problematize the pathological or biomedical explanations for the behaviors of Israeli Zionists. And you write, and I'm quoting here, because we encounter the Israeli smug cruelty most acutely through individuals, be they government officials, soldiers, or formerly known as sort of warriors, it is easy to perceive it as an individuated societal psychosis. Psychosis replaces politics and history. It obscures how societies arrive at ideologies, transmit them over time, and how dehumanization is preceded, constructed, and justified so that it can be rendered with intention, end quote. So talk a little bit about how the psychologizing reflects, as you know, an inability to make sense within a particular ethical or moral frame what we are witnessing.
Yeah, so this essay, which I wrote back in April, actually, was born out of me asking myself the question that I opened that essay with, which is what is going on or what's wrong with the Israelis? And a number of conversations I was having with just like friends of mine who were in medicine, because that happened to be the cohort of people I was around, and hearing what they were saying. And I kept hearing over and over that it was somehow mental illness that was responsible for their behavior. Like I remember one person saying, literally, it goes to show that mental health is real. And I was really stunned by that coming from the same people who are very comfortable saying that, you know, like depression isn't your fault or anxiety isn't your fault. And there's a lot to be said as like separately in a different conversation about sort of the role of the social and the political on what we consider to be mental health issues. But specifically when it comes to genocide and people that are perpetrating genocide, what falls away when you psychologize is blame. And so I was having a very hard time figuring out where to put responsibility in all of this, like watching these Israeli soldiers who did not seem to be able or did not want to see us seeing them or didn't care. And those three things, like it matters which of those three things it is. I needed to know whether they knew what they were doing because I needed to know whether they were liable. And the conversations I was seeing had around it on like social media or whatever referenced psychology a lot to explain it. And I think Fanon has something to do with this because he talks a lot about like settler psychosis or generalized psychopathy. And And people don't really have a language. I don't know if it's because of secularization or like what it is, but we don't have a language to talk about why people cause harm to other people that doesn't reach for the biomedical or mental health. And so what I was trying to do with this essay is to figure out how, on the level of a society, you come to mass produce a behavior that is reflected in individuals, but isn't specific to them. And I think like the answer that I was trying to give, I'm curious to see if this was clear to you when you were reading it, but the answer, like what's like the answer to what is wrong with the Israelis is Zionism. Like this is what Zionism needs them to be and do at this point.
No, I totally agree. And I think it did get across in your article because the main thing that I took away from it was like, let's actually blame structures, right? Or systems rather than even just like individuating it, which obviously like there is, first, to be fair, like there is individuation or the individual like culpability involved here. Like that you have to be as an individual and as a citizen of the Southern Colonial Project, right? You have to have some level of, you know, participation ultimately. So like like it was like literally I think more so in Israeli's context more than even like the US's context and in this contemporary and in a contemporary way because we're in a much different stage of like Southern colonialism, of course, right? That there's like an explicit signed contract. I'm thinking of like Charles Mills talking about this, right? They're talking about like the racial contract, for example, right? And a lot of that stuff is like it's not even it's mostly symbolic. It's mostly like unspoken, but across Israeli society, right? Like it's explicit. It feels like, no, like it feels like as if like you're actively signing on to that when you like a lot of these people are being transported from other countries, right? From Europe, from the US, from other parts of the world, right? And like, and they are aware of like, you know what I'm saying, the type of violence that they're on in a way that it's not the case in the US context, right? Anymore. Obviously it was at one point, but right today, right, because of the colonies has been so disappeared, right, like the indigenous territories have been so disappeared from like public life, you know, I think that shit matters as well, and I also think it matters in the context. I'm even thinking about how we talk about like racism here in the U.S. context. A lot of it is like designated like a mentally speaking, but like rarely, like seldom is it ever talked about in a way that is like structural, like born out of like centuries long like legacy of like of racial domination, if that makes sense. So
yeah, I mean people are very comfortable talking about white supremacy in the abstract,
right,
but like the way I think what is missing a lot of times from the conversations, and you said this earlier, but like you have the structure kind of producing individual agents, but you don't have how individual agents kind of add up to produce a whole that's more than a sum. And what I was trying to do in the essay is like show that process, because I can understand now how like Zionism incentivizes this behavior, but like how did we get to this point? And I think in the essay, the reason why I wanted to start with the first settlers moving into people's houses and show that they knew too, but we're trying at that stage not to think about it. So like you have the language of people abandoning their houses and that sort of thing at that stage, because there needed to be some kind of distancing from what they were doing. It hadn't been normalized into the social fabric yet. And then as you kind of move along, because this is something I think about often when Israelis have their Flag Day or whatever it's called, the parade that they do, where they march through and kind of just like terrorize the Arabs, and they talk about producing a second Nakba, or now there's like a threat that's pretty commonplace where they just threaten the Arabs with a second Nakba. That means that they knew that there was a first Nakba. So you have that on one hand, and then you have them talking about people abandoning their homes on the other hand. And the only way to really rationalize what that is that the way that they're talking isn't for them at all. Like they're able to hold both of these things in their brains because it doesn't matter. They don't care.
For sure, definitely. And that kind of like leads us into our next question quite seamlessly, because there's this colonial narration of indigenous people abandoning their homes and lands is one in which you can find across multiple different contexts, where genocidal colonialism has taken shape, and Palestine obviously is no different. But in one section of the article, you write how, and I'm quoting here again, for decades after 1948, the Palestinian dispossession foundation to the to the Zionist project went largely ignored by Israeli historians. During its war of liberation, quote unquote, Israel was the underdog, its victory nothing short of a miracle. This historiographic its erasure mirrored much of what happened on the ground. The destruction of hundreds of villages unfit for a modernizing project, the planting of parks and trees in place of Palestinian homes and cemeteries, the careful renaming and the manufactured disappearance of any sign of Palestinian life. Following the declassification of several documents by the Israeli government in the 1980s, a group of Israeli scholars calling themselves the New Historians reassessed the facts. It turned out that Palestinians had been the weaker side until the 1940s. The British had armed and supported the Zionists. The Palestinians had not simply abandoned their homes, and so forth, so on, end quote. So yeah, I would just love for you to discuss historically how this narrative was shaped and continues to serve as kind of a device for moral and political justification.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was trying to get at in that section for me as much as for the reader was like when people talk, for example, about Israelis being brainwashed by their government, right? So trying to say that like the Israeli people are held hostage by their government, trying to blame either leadership or even just Netanyahu. Well, again, it goes back to culpability. This whole essay for me was like trying to figure out like can we hold these people liable for what they're doing? And so I was trying to figure out how a people can know the harm that they're causing without thinking that they need to stop or thinking that it was worth it. And so the introduction of the new historians, which I bring up in a lot of things I write because I think they're so important. You have a movement within Israel, because Palestinians have always been saying that this is what happened. What the new historians uncovered overwhelmingly was not new. It's just that it was coming from the oppressor's mouth, you know? So, which is like what happens with any colonial movement in aftermath. Once the deed is done, or once the harm has been caused, or once whatever is in motion, then you can have the people who caused the harm admit to it, and it becomes sort of like a cleansing, whatever. But it doesn't somehow carry forward into the present. And so in the 1980s, like you said in the passage you quoted, there was a movement of Israelis who, because the Israeli government had removed from the military censor a body of documents that had been previously classified, a bunch of these historians were able to access these files and get a better sense of what had been carried out leading up to and during the Nakba, or the beginning of the Nakba. And they found that mass atrocities had been committed on part of what the Palestinians were saying. And that, by and large, did not change the legitimacy of the project for most Israelis. And so it shows that this idea that if the Israelis knew things would be different just isn't true for most of them. The ones who found out and felt guilty left. I bring up Ilan Pape a little bit later after that paragraph, who is an Israeli historian I imagine most of your listeners are familiar with, because he tried to change the project from within after learning about this history, and then was unsuccessful and realized he had to leave. And I have respect for that. Now, there are other critiques one can make of, I think, most Israeli scholars who, like, even if they're able to criticize Zionism, kind of like lose it a little bit when it comes to Palestinian agency. Like, there's still like a kind of tick where they feel like comfortable telling Palestinians what to do or where they fall short or whatever. I think Pape has actually, even in the past many months, like I've watched him get better at that. He's also just like an incredible historian.
That makes sense. And I think it gets us back to like the individual culpability thing we were talking about earlier, because a not so insignificant amount of like Israelis have dual citizenship. And I'm interested, and again, I know it's easier to say like from someone who lives in the US, right? Like that, oh, you can just leave. I mean, I am curious about this.
Leave.
Right. I'm very curious like how how little extreme measures are taken by the individual, right? In support of like a Palestinian freedom project. Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying? And when it comes to Israelis themselves, right? And when it comes to like culpability in of itself, and like the fact that like, and yeah, I keep up with a lot of this stuff. I keep up with like some of the domestic stuff as well that is happening. I know there are movements, or like quote unquote movements, I should say, that are happening from Israelis, but a lot of that stuff is like, it's so centered on the individual of the leader, or it's centered on like getting the hostages back, and it's like it's not really explicit in its terms or like its demand for to end the siege itself, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, they don't care about Palestinians. And the
Right,
same way the majority of white Americans, I'd say, like, do not care about Black people
right, right,
per se. They care about, like, saving the heart of America. Like, very,
right.
very quickly, anti-racism, in quotes, kind of became like a white self-help industry.
Oh,
It's about making sure that they look good, you know? And it's
definitely.
the same thing in Israel. They care about the occupation insofar as it makes Israel look bad, but they do not care about Palestinians as human beings.
Right. Yeah, and I'm very interested in that too. How I like, even again back to the question about or the quote you had about the new historians, for example, and how that those type of projects become these kind of like humanizing projects. Like, oh yeah, we're recognizing, you know, what we're
Yeah.
doing. How in Canada it's very like common to, like, you know what I'm saying, to do the land and knowledge and things like that. It's like that's after the deed has already been done, and while the shit is ongoing, right, and we're still seeing like the reminiscences of its violence or expressions of its violences. And yeah, I think acknowledgement or like even the historicizing, you know what I'm saying, what took place is not enough when, like, if you're not actively, you know what I'm saying, participating in like trying to transform those conditions, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, it makes total sense. And I wrote about this in a different essay for Protean, but I have found that, like, when a news agency like the Washington Post or whatever is reporting on, let's say, what's happening on the ground in Gaza today, even they do it after the fact, like once the harm has been done, and they do it in a way to instill a sense of defeat so that you can't see how, like, suffering adds up to struggle ever. And then the US is, I think, probably the best example of this, where, like, we've admitted to Abu Ghraib, we critique Guantanamo, we talk about Vietnam, we talk about the civil rights movement. You know, like, this country is so good at honoring the legacies of its quote unquote like freedom fighters after they've killed them all.
Right.
Um, and the new historians, especially Benny Morris, who, I mean, is still at it. Like, he wrote something, I don't know when it was, in the New York Times, basically justifying what Israel is doing in Gaza now. And he's always been very honest about it. But this man knows, well, he's twisted some facts, I'll say. But he had access to all the archives. Like, he knows about the mass rapes. He knows all of it. And he acknowledges it, like you said, in a way to put it in the past and also to put it in a specific frame that presents Israel as redeemable in the same way that the US does. Like, sure, we did this and we learned from it, and we're not like this anymore.
Definitely. That's definitely, yeah, that's absurd to me. I didn't know that he was still active, but
Oh, he's still at it. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, that's insane. Yeah, shifting gears a little bit. I appreciate the emphasis on the spiritual, religious aspects of that grounds a lot of the historical and current civilizing colonial projects. And I'm quoting you at length here again, where you write, in the decades before the Nakba, the justifications for colonizing Palestine had been the decision itself. God and the British, in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, had promised Zionists the land, and it was their duty to actualize it. The Palestinians, whom Zionists still refer to as Arabs, a linguistic distinguish the people from the land, were in the way. And you continue by saying, in those early days before the state's machinery had refined the process, the Zionist project's foot soldiers sometimes struggled to sustain the narrative they had imposed onto reality, end quote. So yeah, can you talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but that was why I wanted to explore. So in the essay, I the second part of the essay, I open with Israeli soldiers who have been cooking in Palestinians' homes, and were asked by an interviewer who was profiling them for Haaretz, which is a liberal Zionist magazine that I imagine reviewers or listeners are familiar with. But the interviewer asked them how they kind of reconcile the fact that they're using this home with the fact that it belonged to people who were there before them. And you can see the soldier, like, saying kind of what he knows he needs to say, which is like, oh, you know, it's a little uncomfortable. And then he's like, yeah, but, you know, this is war. And I looked through sort of some, like, archives and some historical documents to see what the first Israelis, and even before Israelis, with settlers who had moved pre-1948, how they reconciled the homes that they were living in with the fact that these homes belonged to other people who were present everywhere. Because, like, now you have sort of a state apparatus through the education system, through the military, which is part of the education system, that has created a distancing of the people from the land and the people of the land in certain pockets of what was Palestine, what is still Palestine. there's a distancing that's happened. So you don't have to think about it as much. But before, it was pretty obvious what you were doing. And I was curious how those people justified it to themselves. And so you see, like, early on, if you look at in the newsletters for the first kibbutzes, for example, Zionist settlers, many of whom were from Europe, who were socialists, who had this idea that they were coming to Israel to establish a country that was founded on progress or whatever, trying to reconcile that and these ideas of socialist values with what they were doing on the ground, which is living in other people's homes, and acting as the frontier for a country that had forced these people out of their homes. And a lot of them, the majority of them, if you look, were fine with it. And there's a colonial mentality that's inherent to the very founding of the country, where, like, it's unfortunate this happened to these people, but we deserve this land more. And these people weren't operating from a place of God promised it to us, because they were often secular, but there was a supremacy to it. And it was European white supremacy. It was, we understand the value of this land and what we can do with it better than the uncivilized native population, and therefore we are more deserving. And it's unfortunate, and that's that.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate that. And shifting gears here again, you write something I really believe gets at something I've been debating and struggling over incessantly over these past couple of months, where how innocence becomes an ontological state, right? How one can construct a reality where, as you know, and I'm quoting here, a call to stop even reverse implementation of genocidal ideology becomes a call to genocide. Political and religious identities merge, reaction precedes action, causality is perfectly inverted, and the danger starts with the Arabs intending to destroy the Jews rather than with Zionist settlers claiming Palestinian land. I would just love if you could discuss this a bit.
Yeah. Well, I was trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing in Gaza today, which is literally just the Israelis blaming everybody but themselves for their actions. And that has been the case since the country's founding. And I think it's like pretty common of settler colonies not to want to be held liable for their actions. Like, if you look at like the first instance of a hospital being bombed, I think it was like as soon as planes were able to fly, more or less people started thinking about how to use them, the Europeans really, to drop bombs. And it was the Italians flying over Libya, and it was before planes could carry a lot of weight. And so just like a handheld thing, they opened the cockpit and dropped some bombs over medical facilities. And I think it was not the Red Cross, it was the Red Crescent at the time in Libya, but they filed a complaint to the UN. And in response, the Italians said, oh, you should try and make sure that your hospitals are better marked with like clear Red Crescent or Red Cross signs so that this doesn't happen again. So like inverting who is responsible. And I think it's like a common tactic in war, but what's strange in Israel is like the extent to which it's just across the entire population. Like, I think Israelis really believe that we want to die. Like, Arabs do not value life. And so like killing us in a way is giving us this like martyrdom that we crave. And not that like we are willing to die for our people to live. Like, there's just this like, because the native is completely emptied of any kind of logic, and the Israelis can project onto us whatever meaning they want to so that their reality can make sense, what ends up happening is like a complete inversion of like what this appears to be to anybody else. So like, you look at the genocide in Gaza, and you and I see the Israelis committing genocide, but Haaretz is able to like headline that like Hamas has laid a genocide trap for Israel. Like, do you know what a genocide trap is? I have no idea.
No, absolutely. And I think that's like my favorite aspect of the article. I think you try to lay out how not just the inadequacy of like biomedical explanations for the behavior itself, right? And how the Zionist logic warps all logic, but rather how like these logics are constructed, right? And if through these like racialized lenses, like you have to dehumanize the Arab population, right? You have to dehumanize Arab men in particular, right? In order to make this case, right? That like they that they exist in a way that is ontologically a threat to the Jewish being, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
And
They
then,
only they exist for nothing else. They only exist to kill you.
right, right. And yeah, that's interesting. And I also think it's really about and this is becoming an ontological state. I keep coming back to that because I really think that is something you said about how, like, we've seen over these past couple of months, from all sectors of, like, how do I say this in a way that's not offensive? There's like multiple different sectors I've seen how, like, Jewishness is mobilized, even on the left, right? That it becomes like, even I'm seeing this in even organizing spaces. And excuse me if I butchered this explanation, but it's something I've been thinking about quite and talking with friends quite often. So, like, bear with me here. But, like, even on the left in organizing spaces, I've seen Jewish people mobilized in a way where, like, they are front and center. You know what I'm saying? We keep getting this, like, as a Jewish person, this is, and it's like, and they're used as like a kind of like a vessel to project.
Yeah, they're making it about them.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really fascinating. It's a really fascinating conundrum. And then you have on the contrary, right? And then you have, like, the Jewish right who's doing this kind of thing where it's like, because they experienced an historical oppression by the way of the West, right? That they somehow are incapable of committing a genocide, but in that same vein, right, that they have a right to commit a genocide. This is really weird, contradictory thing that's happening over, like, and it's been fascinating to see it happening across time and space.
Yeah, I'm not sure how those, like, I'm trying to think in my mind because I see what you're saying about the relationship on the centering of religion. And I know that that's not the intention, but Palestinians try really, I mean, Arabs in general try really, really hard to make it clear that this is not about religion. This is about settler colonialism. Like, we're the occupier of any religious identity. Like, that would not change how the Palestinians feel about them, how the Lebanese feel about, like, that would not change that relationship. And so it is quite counterproductive when Jewish people, I don't think that they mean to cause, like, for this to happen, but, like, they're re-inscribing the significance of religion in this conflict.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When it's not about religion, it's about settler colonialism. And so, like, I think it's an important conversation to be had for, like, Judaism's sake. Like, what is Judaism and what does it stand for? And is Israel really a country that can speak for it?
Mm-hmm.
But that's not a conversation that's relevant at all to Palestinian liberation.
Right.
And it, like, completely decenters the people who are, you know?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, it's something that I think it's, like, again, where somehow Jewishness becomes in this, like, really weird way a placeholder for whiteness, and then it becomes kind of the vessel upon which people from every single sector of, like, political life are able to, like, mobilize humanity, if that makes sense. Again, from the left, we're seeing it from the right, and we're seeing, like, it's a really, really fascinating conundrum, and then it's quite bizarre because it's
a distraction.
Yeah, definitely. It's totally a distraction. Absolutely. And that's,
but on the, sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead. Go ahead. I was going to move on.
No, I was going to just talk about the second part of what you said, which is, like, how the right is talking about how a past harm committed in Europe by Europeans against Europeans somehow becomes a ticket to be able to do whatever you want in a different place, and then, like, blame that place. I mean, it's a win-win. It's a win for both Europe and Israel, and that Europe has kind of repaid its debt for having committed the Holocaust, and very anti-Semitic Europe has saved itself its quote-unquote Jewish problem, which is what they called it.
I totally agree. And that's why I love how you use ontology here, because it's really fascinating, because we're also seeing it with other groups as well. And I think we're getting, like, a blueprint. Like, I really think that we're seeing it, because I don't know. And I know this is, like, getting into some, like, weighty, like, some problematic waters or whatever the case is, but I've seen it when it comes to, even, like, when it comes to Black folks, and how I've seen, like, this kind of, like, in the past decade, and in particular, a neocolonialism mobilized in a way that, like Black people in positions of, like, power, right? And being able to, like, mobilize or, like, operate the machinery of war, for example, is mobilized in such a way because because of racial slavery or because of like, and that is used as like a kind of a justification, and not just in the eyes of like the right, but also in the eyes of liberals as well, that like there's something inherently innocent about, you know what I'm saying, a certain racialized people,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
people who've experienced a historical atrocity or atrocities. And therefore they're mobilized in such a way in support of neocolonialism and in support of neo-imperialism that is like, that's a rightful, place, but it's operating in service of white power though. It's operating in service of Europe, Euro America, if that makes sense. And so it's not even
Yeah.
about the masses of racialized people, right? It's not about the masses of Jewish people in this case, right? It's like who benefits from this project is very distinct, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, good and evil become states that you inherit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and like, I think it's like the foil of victimhood. Like when we talk about intergenerational trauma as something that you like literally inherit in your epigenetic makeup or your genetic makeup instead of something that you inherit because those circumstances haven't gone away
Yeah.
materially. Or like when you talk about like a white person kind of like inheriting their like ancestors' sins, and like having to repay the debts of their ancestors. It's not about what you inherited, it's about what you're still doing. And so like the issue with like it's not who you are, it's what you do that makes you, I mean, nobody's like entirely good or entirely bad either, but it's your actions that determine where you fall on like this like the moral spectrum. And we have this like I think it's kind of evolved in line with the currency of victimhood in a way, but Israel's a perfect case of this, where because of like one historical victimization, you now have a carte blanche to be like a perennial victim. Like victimhood becomes an identity.
Right.
Instead of like a product of a very specific historical material situation that does not carry over to any other relationship with any other human being. Like you're not justified. It also like I'm like slipping a little bit into psychologizing here because I'm talking about Israel as if it's a person instead of like being a country. And that's like something that I think we struggle with a lot when we talk about how like nation states or even like individuals who are in positions of government power, when we talk about like what drives their behavior, and like slip into like psychologizing, instead of like, I don't know, trying to stay on the ground.
No, that's interesting. And I do think it's a tough line, I think, because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
because I do think there's something, I think it has to do with the mind too, though, as well. Like, I think what it does, and I know I said it earlier, like Zionist logic warps all logics. Like, I think that, like, it has to, but it starts obviously with the structure itself, right? But like, like, up to that point, like, it takes so much to get to a point where someone is so okay with mass death, right? Experiencing it, right? I'm even thinking about, again, not to make it about the US again, but like even the US context, but like 500,000 people
Don't make
died,
it about the US. They're one thing. They're one thing.
right? But like 500,000 people died in the US for COVID. And like there was like, I feel like we didn't take a moment to like, I don't think we even got given like a moment of silence type of thing. You know what I'm saying? It kind of just like happened in a blink of an eye over the course of a year or two. And like, it was like, and like, how can you construct a society that is so okay with mass death, right? I'm thinking about Israeli society in particular, but there's, again, across colonial societies, like how are you okay when you see violence, when you see neglect, organized abandonment, when you see, you know what I'm saying, mass death happening, and you're just like, and you can go on as usual. You can continue to go to work, right? You can post on TikTok. You can do all these things that you know what I'm saying? While all this
Yeah.
should happen. And I think about it for a second. I think that absolutely has something to do with the mind as well. But it can't begin and end there, though, because it's so much beyond that. And I think you do a really good job at laying that out in your article.
Yeah, I think it depends on what material reality requires, like what you will do to either cope or address or whatever word we want to use. But like in the case of the US with COVID, for example, you can kind of just pretend that it's not happening. And unless you're checking certain news outlets that are reporting on it or whatever, you just wouldn't know. And you can go on in your like individuated bubble and carry on as if nothing is happening. In Israel, it's different because you have mandatory conscription and the Palestinians are right there. And so I think something that I was trying to figure out too in the essay is like in the US, for example, if you think about Native Americans, you don't really have to think about them because
Yeah.
they were killed. The overwhelming majority of Native Americans were killed. And like the idea of this country being a settler society is much, you can push that much farther away without having to do a lot of like mental gymnastics. In Israel, you have two options. You either do the mental gymnastics or you kill the natives. And like, you
Definitely.
don't, but like, the way to not have to do the mental gymnastics is to be in the army,
Mhm.
and then you can just handle it,
Right.
right? And that's kind of how they've learned to see Palestinians.
No, definitely.
But
No,
it's
that's
also how they had to see them to start. That's the tough part, is like when you were saying it goes back to structures, it goes back to structures at a certain point. But like what precedes that is individual human beings making decisions. And that's like, and like what sustains the structure is also individual people. And so it's like, this is something, and I clearly didn't clear it up for myself by writing the essay. Um, but yeah, like all like structures are composed of people, and like
definitely.
somehow it's up to like them not seeing, but not feeling liable for what they're doing in the same way that you would feel that moral weight if it was just interpersonal.
No, that's definitely true. Um, and I don't ever mean to like pretend like individuals cannot or not are culpable, because they definitely are. Um, and,
Oh
and
yeah,
I,
no, yeah. No, I'm not saying that you're not saying that.
oh no, no,
Yeah,
I'm thinking generally too, because it's like I'm thinking about like the stages too, like and how like we keep trying to make these clean cut, like I don't know, because I had this argument a while back because people don't recognize the U.S. as a settler colonial nation anymore, um, and which I think is like so anti-materialist in a sense, because I think it forgets like that how it's been disappeared, that process has been disappeared because it's gone on for so long, and that
yeah,
like they've been able to disappear indigenous people from like again social civic life in general, in a way that it's not true for Palestine. And I think you have to think about these things in stages, and I think what you're getting at here, like how individuals like it started with individuals, right? It started with, but even that though, it's like it started with Europe, no? Like it started like I'm sure
it's like structure and agency is always like a
it's
back and forth. It did start with Europe, though. Everything is.
of course, yeah, of course. Everything comes back to that bastard place. But um yeah, it's a really fascinating like thing to me because it's like, I don't know. It's there's no winning regardless. And like even if it's like but I do think there needs to be a greater emphasis on like indicting the entirety of the society, and then how everyone participates in it in some way or another. Right. And how everyone like, you know what I'm saying? Even the people who are like even individual natives, for example, can participate in that process, right? Of like domination. And like the state requires so much cooperation from so many different avenues. And I think even we're seeing this, and again, I keep coming to the US because the US is like such a major example of like sort of colonialism just at a different stage. Because like I think like what the student movements have shown us and what it reminded us of or taught us even is that like every single institution, educational, cultural institution is invested in imperialism, right? It's invested in the project of colonialism. And it's like nothing, like you can't, there's nothing that we can like, you know, say that has come out unscathed out of this. It's like,
Yeah.
why the fuck is your like university and like, I don't know, in fucking Alabama invested in genocide and Palestine. Like what, like, you know what I'm saying? It's gotten us to a place where we're asking these questions finally. So, and I'm very obviously I'm very level headed when it comes to protests in general these days. As someone who participated in the protests of the 2010s and all that stuff, like I know how these things work. But like I think it's good that people are finally like are seeing and like, being able to articulate and name the numbers that are being like the amount of money that is being wielded and across time and space for this project, right? For the project of Zionist colonialism, for the project of other colonial imperialist projects as well. That is an objectively a good thing if that makes sense. But yeah,
Yeah, so something like along that line that has continued to shock me is how committed people are to this idea of like the Israel lobby, which is somehow separate from the United States, that like incentivizes America to act in ways that are not in line with its interests. And it's just like, can you not like the tail wagging the dog kind of thing? And I know like Max Isle has come on this podcast and talked about it, but it is amazing to me how tightly people will hold on to that instead of like reevaluating what the role of this country is and has always been and will always be
Mhm.
in the world.
Right. Definitely. Absolutely agree. Yeah. So shifting gears a little bit, which is not really shifting because I think it's around the same logic, but I'm thinking of Fanon's concept of the systematized negation of the other. And you're thinking of this, you write how, and I'm quoting here again. On the other side of the Zionist coin, the Arabs exist as not as fodder for guilt, but as the internal enemy, the human shields and animals, the masses to bomb around election time, on whom to experiment and showcase murderous technology for export. Palestinians exist on the state's periphery as both mirror and threat, hoping Zionists articulate an identity projected against and shaped by the existential foil. In other words, textbook Orientalism. Palestinians are the glue that holds Israel together, end quote. The last sentence, I'm just incredibly interested in. Can you talk about how that is so?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what Israel is, it's a bunch of people who have nothing in common except an identity label, which doesn't necessarily mean that they have anything in common, who were put together in a project and told that like what they have in common is that they like belong on this land. And there's constantly the Palestinian threat, and the Arab threat, really, that like surrounds them, and makes them feel that they like are together against that threat. And I think like you see it most clearly around, I mentioned that in the paragraph that you cited, around like election time, like, and I mean, the US is not super different in this way, but like bombing Palestinians helps whoever is in power stay in power. And on October 7, or like in the immediate aftermath of October 7, you saw like collectivizing that was written about in like places like Haaretz in Israel that like hadn't happened for a long time, especially because of the mass protests that had been taking place for the past many months. It's gone away now. You see like an internal Israel like seems to be now kind of imploding in a way. But for a period of time, like it held them together. And like really what they have in common is that the external enemy. But like as like what it's a made up idea, you know?
Definitely, that is true. And this last question for this particular article,
Yeah.
you can just say a word about how the early Zionists failed to do a complete job and how that has led us to this point.
Yeah. So early on, like around the time of the Nakba, some of the initial planners like debated whether or not Israel would be able to last if the native population wasn't entirely wiped out, because ultimately what Israel has over the Palestinians is force, just like any settler colony. I think Sina Rahmani on the East is a podcast talked about how like the way that the West wages war is basically holding over like that, like the people, the specter of genocide. That's always been like what Israel has. And over time, what has changed is that the native is a little bit more able to respond. And as soon as the native can respond, Zionist supremacy, which is like reliant on, I mean, it's entirely artificially produced by that specter of genocide, kind of falls apart. And so what you see right now is Israelis doubling down on that artificial supremacy that is afforded them by their advanced weaponry to try and like reassert their identity as like over the native, which is like basically what Israeli identity is. It's just like supremacy over Palestinians. Like, I don't know. I would love for somebody to tell me something else about what, like how else to define Israel, but from like the perspective of their victims, that's like what they are and what they have.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that. So yeah, now we turn our attention to an article you published in December 2023, also in the Baffler, titled "No Side to Fall," and medical neutrality in Gaza. Can you say a word about the concept of medical neutrality and how it emerged in the mid 1800s?
Yeah. So in the mid 1800s, there was a battle called the Battle of Solferino that happened between a couple of European powers that were warring. And it was a super bloody battle. And what was noticed is that the nurses who had been trying to get to bodies that had been injured were unable to recover those bodies, and people ended up dying en masse on the battlefield, or were unable to get taken to places where they could get treated soldiers. And there was a man named Henry Dunant who witnessed this battle and wrote about it afterward. And he was ultimately responsible for the idea that became the Red Cross. He was a Christian Zionist, but that isn't that relevant to this story. And what he proposed was a set of medical volunteers who would belong to neither warring party and therefore be granted medical immunity because they were neutral, so that they could recover the bodies and get them to medical treatment in a timely fashion. And so that's where the concept of medical neutrality comes from. And it was intended at that point to be a means to medical immunity, so the doctors, nurses could do their work on the battlefield.
Definitely. So you make note of how, and I'm quoting here again, 1935 saw the first recorded instance of the ICRC engaging in what is now called humanitarian diplomacy in response to Italy's effort to colonize Ethiopia. The British would take over this colonial project during World War II. As a neutral body, the ICRC offered medical support to both Italians and Ethiopians. The former declined as they had sufficient personnel and equipment, while the latter, after decades of de-development, welcomed the aid. The Italian military have subsequently bombed over a dozen medical facilities, clearly marked with red crosses, as part of their fascist aggression aimed at quelling native resistance to collective punishment. War and occupation, like medicine, continue to evolve. Today in Israel and elsewhere, occupation soldiers injured on enemy soil are airlifted out of battlefields and taken to their own state-of-the-art military hospitals for treatment. Wartime illuminates the absurdity of ideological neutrality. A military doctor, operatively integral to and salaried by a military body, has functionally taken aside. Neutrality has never intended to be a moral commitment, but rather a means to immunity. The logic of at Geneva went, we mean you no harm, and we can help you, so colony don't hurt us. For this reason, medical neutrality is easily decoupled from immunity wherever medical services are not needed. It is a solution for a practical problem, and today the Israeli military has no use for the ambulances, hospitals, and medical staff and Palestinians in Gaza. This incentivizes, from a purely strategic perspective, commitment to their own protection. End quote. So can you just discuss the racialized limitations of medical neutrality as observed in Italy's and then Britain's efforts to colonize Ethiopia in 1930s?
Yeah. So moving back a little bit, the initial formulation of medical neutrality practically as a means to medical immunity emerged out of an old school battlefield, right? So you have two warring sides that are in the same geographic area that both need medical aid on that same terrain. And they were also both Europeans that were recognized by the other side as different countries generally. And so there are a number of differences between the way that medical neutrality and immunity were imagined in the formulation of the Red Cross and the Geneva Conventions and what plays out in the colonial situation, but also in just modern day warfare. So in the colonial situation, it's not considered a war between two parties because one side isn't a state. And so it's an internal thing. I don't know what the language is. I'm not a legal scholar, but it's not considered a war in the same way. The colonized consider it a war, but the colonizer does not consider it a war. They consider it quelling a rebellion or something. And so the language that is written around what is happening changes, but what also changes is that the colonizer generally does not have, since at least aerial bombardments were possible in the early 1900s, the colonizer doesn't have use for the medical facilities of the colonized. Generally, the colonized have been under siege or whatever it is. And so their medical facilities, their clinics are considered inferior. And the colonized has like their own, or the colonizer has their own military equipment, their own or medical equipment, their own medical facilities that they take their soldiers to. And in the case of Israel specifically, as it pertains to Gaza today, which is what I was talking about in part of the section that you quoted, Israel like airlifts its soldiers via helicopter to its own medical hospitals outside of Gaza. And so there's no situation in which Israel would ever have use for the medical facilities in Gaza. And if it doesn't have use for them, then the basis for medical neutrality just like doesn't apply anymore. Like medical neutrality as it was formulated relies on both sides needing those facilities, right? And so in the colonized situation in Ethiopia, for example, the Italians were able to do the same thing. They were able to bomb medical clinics in Ethiopia in the same way that the US bombed medical facilities in Vietnam, as did the French, for a couple of reasons. One, they didn't have use for them. And then separately, like the colonized did as life-saving spaces. And if your whole point is to kind of kill the native into submission, then you need to get rid of the hospitals. And then the human shielding argument, or like the militants using areas proximal to the hospitals or to the medical facilities argument, those two things kind of like come hand in hand to justify the targeting of hospitals after the fact. So once the hospitals are bombed, then you say, oh, well, there were militants operating proximally, or in the case of guerrilla warfare, because the militant might be anywhere, it means that you can bomb anywhere and then say that after the fact. And then because of the law of proportionality, which basically says that civilian harm needs to be balanced with military advantage, that's kind of what Israel relies on today. But it allows for the bombing of hospitals when they are being used according to the colonizer, in this case Israel, but according to the Italians, according to the Americans, according to the French, by militants for some activity that like compromises some kind of military goal.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you break that down. Yeah, and it kind of gets us to our next question, because I think I'm going to read a fairly long excerpt, but from the piece, but you articulate the colonial tactic quite well. So again, and I'm quoting here, during the Algerian anti-colonial struggle against the French, the latter regularly targeted medical infrastructure directly and through siege. The French restricted access to medicines and equipment, enabling the proliferation of infectious diseases and other preventable illnesses among the civilian population. More than a decade later or earlier, elsewhere in Europe's colonies, the Italians defended their right to target Ethiopian hospitals and medical facilities by asserting that primitive civilizations were incapable of comprehending and therefore abiding by the principles of the Geneva Conventions and the Red Cross. The Italian Red Cross claimed that the barbaric Ethiopian warriors believed that hospitals possessed miraculous powers and that they exploited hospitals to conceal ammunition depots and military establishments. And then the second point was denied by doctors on the ground, and it quickly became the Italians' unsubstantiated word against that of their victims. Though both parties were speaking through their local branches of the ICRC, it's not hard to guess whose word carried more weight. End quote. So this to you is not a reflection of inconsistency or hypocrisy, as it is often described. Instead, it's a consequence of not seeing racialized and colonized people as human, because that is how these laws were constructed by those who consider themselves as human, for others who they also consider to be equally as human. So talk about this a bit, if you will.
Yeah, this goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier, where like the Israelis kind of do what they want and then blame everybody except themselves.
Right.
Like, it's kind of just like how colonial powers operate. They're never responsible for their actions. And it's like because of racialized tropes that have been kind of like injected into the colonizer population for decades or centuries, it's like believable as far as like the propagandized people need that like the colonized are hiding weapons in hospitals or using their own people as shields because they're so like blinded by their hatred or whatever. And that justifies the bombing of hospitals. Now, that like the Red Cross, for example, would apply law, like what is humanitarian law, or that the humanitarian law as afforded by the Red Cross would apply differently to a colonized population and a colonizer isn't hypocrisy to me because one population is seen as human and one population isn't. So like they're applying humanitarian law everywhere they see people. Like Israel isn't behaving inconsistently in Gaza because as far as they're concerned, these aren't people. And so like humanitarian applies wherever there are people and there aren't any in Gaza. And I think like describing the behavior as hypocrisy or inconsistency just like fails to see what is going on. I'm curious like what you thought when you read that.
Well, when I read the excerpt that I read off, or just article?
No, like when you read like the like why the inconsistency or hypocrisy, like why that point spoke to you.
Oh no, because I think it's something to be said about this idea. First of all, there's always like this inscribed innocence, to that it's just people being a hypocrite, and I think there's something about that logic that it seems to me to provide a layer of relief or something. I think about that even in the context of like how people think about like politicians, for example, where it's always think about how they talk about Western politicians versus like politicians in like the what I'm saying in the third world, for example, where it's like for the third world politicians, like if they do something wrong or do something bad, they're terrible people. They're Hitlerites. They're they're dictators. They're all these different things. But like when we talk about what's the guy Benjamin? What's his last name? I'm sorry, I'm drawing up blank. Yeah, talk about him. We talk about Biden. We talk about politicians that are either Western or accepted by the West. In a way that is so much nicer, in a way that is like not an indictment of their entire being or in the entire political processes that they're governing under, if that makes sense. That reflection, this idea of or inconsistent, or they're just inconsistent, or they're just like you saying a hypocrite, or they're just what I'm saying.
It's because they have values.
Yeah.
And then they're just not applying these values to a select subset of the population, which they should be able to do because they know better. And it implies that they like otherwise are acting better. When like, no, these people are just like morally rotten to their core and they're not being consistent. Like the US is being incredibly consistent in how it applies humanitarian law only insofar as it serves it and nowhere else. It's not that it like isn't applying the laws that it otherwise believes in to the Palestinians. No, it's that this country stands for nothing except like death and destruction.
Right.
Definitely. And it's like actually incredibly consistent. It's just that you're missing the point.
And I think that's the main thing too. I think that's the biggest point that you just made. That everything they're doing is consistent. And if we actually studied history, and if we actually understood the kind of structures that they were operating under, and how like such a project has come to be what it is today, how Israel has become what it is today, then we can understand that like the logic that is happening, the logic that is being mobilized to justify this genocide is actually incredibly in line with everything that has come up to place. I mean, everything that's happened up to this point, if that makes sense. Yeah,
I think that like what I was trying to do in the first essay that we talked about, where like, I mean, in some ways, the way that Israel is behaving right now, I think it's like taking itself to self-destruction, especially if it decides to go into Lebanon. But Israel can't stop because as soon as like the image of supremacy goes away, like that artificially constructed supremacy, there is no Israel left. And so like in some ways, it's like engaging in its own self-destruction, but in another way, like it doesn't really have an option,
right?
Because its sense of supremacy is threatened, and so it's not illogic. It's just that like the internally guiding logic is inconsistent with reality, and it has been for a long time, but it hasn't had to face consequences. I'm actually writing an essay about this right now, which is why it's like so fresh on my brain. And I think because Israel's like quote unquote enemies, well, not quote unquote, they are Israel's enemies, now have like some material means of raising the stakes and like creating some sort of consequences for Israel's behavior. You have like this frenzied doubling and tripling down. It's not illogic. It's just that like the guiding logic does not correspond to a reality that like exists anymore.
Right. No, I think there's something to be said, even like if we can describe the actions of the last, 7 or 8 months or so as being intensified, that like the bare logic of Zionism has been, what I'm saying, dispossession and like the elimination of the native, simply put, right? Like it's like, and what you can argue, because I know some people would argue with like what response was to say like that. I don't think that the state wanted to, like, to just eradicate, 40,000-50,000 people in less than a year. Like that's not what they like. That's not their preferred way to go. And maybe that is true, right? But I also think that it's like, even if it wasn't, in that time span, I think it's fair to say that they like that they're still okay with the mass death, though. You know what I'm saying? And that is something that is like acceptable or seen as like, again, justifiable, as we've seen them do the last couple of months. They've been justifying it with many different reasons, right? So it's like this idea that like, even if it's the intensification and the indiscriminate bombing is, again, a bad look internationally speaking, because obviously people are turning, like, looking that way, right? But it's like, at the same time, still like it falls in line with the logic itself, right? That is like, that is the end goal. This was the end goal. It's just like it's just kind of like the offensive on October 7th forced them to kind of like intensify it, if that makes sense. Or like not even intensify, but rather like, I guess intensify does work. I don't know. Yeah. Does that make sense at all? I don't know.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Like, I think what happened is that their hand was forced. This isn't these are the means, and they will be enacted like to the extent that like Israel requires them to be. And if supremacy is threatened, then they need to like reassert the principle of deterrence or whatever, like their supremacy, and they're going to kill more people. And like Israelis care about what's happening in Gaza because it makes Israel look bad. So it's not the preferred means of getting rid of the native, because people don't do that anymore, but not because they care about Palestinian life, but they don't care that much about what people think, as long as they'll continue to get weapons, I mean, there is like a portion of the Israeli public that does care about their international image. But again, it's not because they care about Palestinian life. It's because they care about preserving Israel.
Exactly.
And so like the fundamentals are still like the Palestinians don't matter as people. And like, how could they matter when you like built your society on top of them? Like it doesn't, there is no world in which Zionism will take into account Palestinian well-being, because if it did, it wouldn't exist. And as soon as it does, it doesn't exist.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Before we move to the next section, your last article, well, not last article, but the last article we're talking about here today, I just love for you to offer any reflections on your reading of Frantz Fanon's A Dying Colonialism, which to me is probably Fanon's like most underrated, underread text, and namely the chapter that he dedicates to the role of doctors, because I think this gets us right into our next section.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is most compelling to me about Fanon, and that was kind of like the ending of the Baffler essay, the one about medical neutrality that we've been talking about, is he makes very clear that there is no doctor without politics. Like a doctor is embedded in the world that they're in, and they have a choice to make between what politics they will ascribe to themselves. But like pretending like a doctor doesn't take a side, and it's usually a binary, is silly. And I've been thinking about it quite a bit in like the setting of doctors here, because I think it's like more obvious in the colonial situation, right? Like you're either working in Guantanamo or in Abu Ghraib or in Israeli prisons, or in like an Israeli military hospital, or you're not. But like in the case of doctors here, like my peers, my colleagues, the overwhelming majority of them have had nothing to say about Gaza because of like their understanding of medical neutrality, which is incredibly convenient for them in their jobs, which is that a doctor isn't supposed to take a side. And I think like what's so powerful about how Fanon talks about the doctor is that like they are actively an arm of oppression until they choose not to be, because they're embedded in these like oppressive apparatuses. I'm wondering, like I have the book in front of me and I'm looking at it, but I wonder why it's your favorite book of Fanon's, or like most underrated.
I would say it's his most underrated.
Not favorite. We shouldn't say that.
I was. Well, I would say that there's an argument for it being my favorite, honestly. But like, okay, so I think there's like I've had someone on here a while back that we spoke about Fanon. But this idea, so you have black skin, white mask, which I think the academics love, right? Because it's
Yeah.
pretty revolutionary Fanon. And obviously it's a great text and there's a lot of good stuff in there. Don't get me wrong, like there's a lot of good stuff that's in there, but
Like Adam Schaft is kind of on, yeah.
yeah, it's you can tell why that like so many like scholars or like intellectuals love it. And yeah, and so you have Wretched of the Earth Fanon, of course, which I think obviously is his most well-known text. And then you have like a Dying Colonialism and Toward the African Revolution, which both of those books I love. And I just love the concept of like actually engaged in struggle. Love Fanon, if that makes sense. And there's something about that. And it's as well where it feels more like a pathway, an actual materialist understanding of like the colonial situation and also anti-colonial struggle, if that makes sense. In a way, it's not the case for his earliest work, which is obviously Black Skin, White Mask. And then also his latest work, which I think was Toward the African Revolution. I think that those, A Dying Colonialism and The Post-African Revolution are the two books that I think people do not read nearly as much as they should. And I always recommend them because I think they're both excellent in that way. And that they feel more like a framework and a pathway for how to struggle, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, they're also like incredibly specific. I think something that we miss when we talk about solidarity or struggle is how like even as we're talking about universality, the universal, like when we talk about colonialism, for example, I think we fall into the trap often of talking about struggle in the abstract without talking about what it looks like on the ground, and like kind of offering away from not universality to specificity, but actually specificity to universality. And like what Fanon does really well in A Dying Colonialism, I'm holding and I'm looking at the chapters. And he talks, like the chapters are Algeria Unveiled. This is the voice of Algeria, the Algerian family, medicine and colonialism, and Algeria's European minority. It is very specific to Algeria, the Algerian situation on the ground and like what he was seeing. And the popular cradle specifically in Algeria. So how like the people that were around and shaping and becoming like the revolution, how they like formed and what they were doing in a way that like clarifies what the stakes are of liberation, but also like how it's enacted again on the ground, in a way that like you see and I mean, I think Black Skin, White Masks is like pretty abstract, which is why like it's like for the academics, so like talking about like decolonizing the classroom. And then like The Wretched of the Earth is pretty generalist. Like there are specifics, but it's not like how a people resist in this way. I don't know. Also, these books are just smaller. Like when I read A Dying Colonialism, I read it cover to cover in one sitting during the pandemic, which you cannot do with A Wretched of the Earth. So it feels like a guidebook, like you were saying. Yeah,
and towards the African Revolution is very similar. I think it's like 200 words or less, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I have it next to me. They're like the same size.
I love a short 200 books. 200 words or less type book. And I think that is like, it's a very like you mentioned, it's very specific in its context, and also like what was going on. And I think there's something about that. It's used to that. It's used to like someone materially being a part of like a struggle and being able to like map out what exactly is happening and how it's happening, and being able to paint a picture for you, I guess, in a way that we like you simply can't if you're not in that context, if that makes sense. Like you can like, I guess, be in archives, stuff like that, and like paint it. Like I don't know, something about it's just a less. I mean, it's a more effective way at like understanding. You know what I'm saying? Like colonialism, ultimately. So. Yeah.
I also think like the part about medicine and colonialism, that chapter, it's like really helpful for doctors here too. Like he talks at length about why a person might not want to go and see the doctor because the doctor has operated basically as an arm of colonialism and like equivalent to the police.
Right.
And like in the US, we have like a lot of patients don't feel comfortable going to see doctors, don't trust their doctors. Like Fanon talks about, for example, this is in Algeria, but like a patient might not like the idea that a patient might have to ask the surgeon, like, am I going to wake up from this, or are you going to kill me? Like that lack of trust in the doctor like carries over to our situation here, because doctors are not of their people. And like he has a line that I think about all the time. I'm trying to find it, but he talks about like how a doctor transforms to being Oh yeah, it's right here. I'm going to read it. The Algerian doctor, the native doctor who, as we have seen, was looked upon before the national combat as an ambassador of the occupier, was reintegrated into the group. Sleeping on the ground with the men and women of the Mechtas, living the drama of the people, the Algerian doctor became a part of the Algerian body. There was no longer that reticence so constant during the period of unchallenged oppression. He was no longer the doctor, but our doctor. And this idea of like belonging to a people so that they trust you so that then you can be a doctor. Like that's like when you realize what you're supposed to be doing for people. It's just like we have it completely backwards here where like you learn the technical skills and then you can just like, especially in global medicine, you like export basically your skills to any population. And because medicine is like this universal skill set, the assumption is you can just pop into any place and operate as a doctor, but also operate as a surgeon. And like what Fiona is saying is that like you need to be a doctor in context. Like you need to belong to the, especially in struggle, belong to the people that you are working with and for, out of a sense of obligation. That's how like you actually doctor properly. I don't know. As like a doctor, it's just like great for me to read and be reminded of like, no, this is like if I'm doing it right, what I should be aiming for.
Absolutely. No, I love that. And I appreciate you breaking that down because I think there's something to be said about, I was speaking about this recently with a friend who's actually a nursing student, but is working in a hospital. And he was mentioning how like he saw, like they went to like the psych, it's a psych ward, I think it was, inside the hospital. And he saw these dynamics between like the doctors and the patients, and he saw how antagonistic it was on both sides. And he also heard how certain doctors spoke to and about their patients, and how it was like he described it like the way he described it. It sounded kind of vile to me. Like it sounded like there was like a truly like doctors did not have much of a care for their patients. The fact that like you know what I'm saying. And so I think there's something to be said about. Especially over these last couple of years where I feel like doctors and nurses and even teachers to a lesser extent, were all kind of glorified as like and romanticized in a way, like as like these heroes. And honestly, in some ways, I'm not saying that like that you can't be one in those positions, but I do think in the way that things are structured, specifically in the US or like in other colonial contexts as well, where like it's like that relationship between, you know what I'm saying, someone who works in a field that requires them to give social medical services, if that makes sense. It's more often than not an antagonistic relationship with those they're serving. You know, and it's something that I say that about like social workers. I say that about teachers. I say that about doctors and nurses. Like there's like, and again, I say this because I went to school with some of these people as well, right? And I know some of these people were. That's mean to say, but I know some people, some people who work now in like social workers that were not great people. And obviously maybe they changed since then, but it's like still on the surface, you can see that it's the way that things are fostered in this kind of institutionalized way. It is not fostered in a way that is really oriented towards like communal care, in a way that like is about prevention and cooperation and actual like building a level of trust between the community. Like most people that I know, especially the racialized and colonized people that I know, many of them like avoid going to the doctors like the plague. Like they see that it's like something that, and it's not just about life or death. It is sometimes it's just about like just like not trusting doctors and not trusting, you know what I'm saying, medical professionals in general. And it's like I don't know, something I'm really fascinated by because I don't know exactly what that will look like to shift that in this specific context. Right. Because like there's so many barriers to that being the case, if that makes sense.
I mean, you'd have to have a different healthcare system, I think, to start. Like this is the systems and agency thing. Like if you have a system where like a person's health or care, it's not actually care, but it's transactional, then that's not care, you know? And where you're monetizing care and incentivizing the wrong sorts of things, like you're incentivizing procedures, for example, where you can bill for more money, and like the parts of medicine, like nursing, where like you might actually be in proximity to human being as such, and like being, I don't know, responsible for them in a way where they're vulnerable to you. That's not incentivized. They don't get paid the way that doctors do, and the people that get paid the most are the people, like I'm training to be a surgeon, and the way that like our training works is most of the time the patient isn't even awake, you know, so like they are entirely reduced to their body for the overwhelming majority of the time, and I'm
Right.
paid the most, you
Right.
know? And so there's a way in which like the setup beyond it being like doctor telling the patient what to do and that kind of like the hierarchy that is inscribed there, like what is incentivized in terms of like medical procedures and that sort of thing doesn't reward anything besides efficiency. And like care is slow. Like listening to people is slow. Building trust happens outside of the hospital or outside of the clinic. Like you have to be of that community already for them. I mean, it can happen inside, but like why should a person who has every reason not to trust you? You have to give them reason to, and you're not going to be able to do that in a 15-minute visit. And it creates a relationship that's just like not, I don't know, it's not like you can't really build trust on that. We have things completely backwards.
Hmm. Right. No, I can see that. I'm very curious if you have any thoughts on like steps or ways. First of all, my friend who's in medical school now, shout out to Jason. And I have other friends who are like in and around med school, nursing school, and like or like training to be doctors and stuff like that. And like, I'm not that person. Well, I'm technically getting my doctorate in social sciences, but it's not the same thing, obviously. But this idea of like, you know, trying to create a different type of relationship to the people you're serving in whatever different capacity, not just even doctors, right? It's just in general, people who have like professional positions that require them to service others, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And again, I watch a lot of medical shows, which is really weird, but like I grew up loving them. My grandmother used to love them. So I watch a lot of them and I see like a lot of the liberal types, like Grey's Anatomy and things like that, seeing these type of shows and how they try to do it and how sometimes it feels like, I don't know if that will work, but like, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like how you're trying to do things differently for yourself. Like, cause you as an individual cannot destroy entire or abolish the current infrastructure and create something anew. It's like, how can you personally try to transform these things,
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, part of how it starts is having an awareness of like the ways that social and political and historical factors shape health. And I think that might in some ways narrow the interventions you're making. Like I'm interested in potentially trauma surgery. And so the porousness between like the way the world acts on a body and then what shows up in the emergency room, I think is like much more obvious to me than it would be to somebody who is, I don't know, like an internal medicine doctor who is treating diabetes. Where like, sure, you can talk about genes, you can talk about personal decisions, but like, are we going to talk about McDonald's? Are we going to talk about capitalism? And I think like having an awareness of how these factors are implicated in individual health and like are shaping the person who's coming in front of you, I think that's a place to start. I think like this is something, I don't know how you teach it. Like, for example, there are courses called like doctoring courses that are given to medical students. I imagine similar things are given to like other medical professionals in their training programs. But like we learn how to deliver bad news and we're given like a script to tell people whose loved one has just died. And it's like an insane thing. Like you can't teach empathy. And when you try to script it, you're actually causing harm. And like, because it's not efficient to care, it's almost trained out of you. And then what's like replaced is scripted and it is very detached from the human being in front of you. And so the way that I've like tried to preserve, I don't know, care or whatever it is for myself is just to like keep in mind the person in front of me first and not to think about like, I treat doctoring as to doctor as a verb. It's not my identity. It's the role that I'm playing in this relationship. And so this is a person in front of me and I'm a person and I have this thing to offer this human being. And so we're equal when I enter into the room. And that's like, I think that's enough to sustain me a clinical level. I think the other thing that I've tried to do, which we're trained not to do, and I remember like early on in med school, I had a patient that I had worked with who was dying and I had a day off and like I thought she was going to die that day. So sorry, I went into the hospital on my day off and the resident who's like the person in charge of me saw me and was like, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "Oh, I wanted to check on this patient and see her." And he said to me that I was going to burn myself out very fast. And it kind of blew my mind how I was being trained not to invest in the people in front of me as a way of protecting myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I just like resent that and reject that. I get what he was trying to do, which is to protect me from whatever we call like moral injury or something. I don't really think that's a thing. I think like it's just called feeling for other people and like responding to injustice and then like trying to individuate it. But like for me, I'm just like trying to keep myself open to feeling, and I know it comes at a cost, but it's not worth it not to care about people as such. Like I'm responsible for a person in my care as long as they're in my care, not, when I'm working. And it's not like, again, it's not incentivized, so we'll see if it lasts, but I don't think it's that complicated. I think if like more people saw the people in front of them as people, that would be enough.
Right. No, actually, I think that's very simple. It makes a lot of sense. And I think you've laid out quite well. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so shifting gears here a little bit, we're talking about another article you put out with The Nation in May, actually. And it's titled "What It's Like on the Front Lines of Gaza's Hospital Hell." And you're talking to Dr. Tanya Haji-Hassan. And as you know in the article, as of May 15th, nearly 500 healthcare workers had been killed by Israel in just 200 days, often through targeted bombing or summary execution within the gates of the hospital complex. And obviously, at the time, that number was likely an undercount. And again, it was weeks ago, and the bombing still has not stopped. But yeah, so to begin, we should just start by discussing the 7 mass graves which have been uncovered at multiple hospitals in Gaza. You asked Tanya a question about an interview she did for Sky News, where she was asked about militants as a sort of pretext or justification for the elimination campaign. Her answer seemed quite exasperated, and rightfully so. She calls the continued focus, both from liberals and conservatives alike, of Hamas and other militant resistance forces as intellectually insulting. An insult to the humanity, as because even if it is true, none of it justifies the Zionist assault. So yeah, maybe talk a little bit about this a bit.
Yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about the history of colonizers accusing the colonized of using hospitals as human shields, or justifying the bombing of hospitals because militants were nearby. And this is just, that same playbook. So there's a concept called proportionality, which we talked about before, which is that warring parties need to maintain a balance between military advantage and the harm that they're causing a civilian population in order to preserve that military advantage. And in Israel's case, they kind of override the problem because there are no civilians as far as they're concerned in Gaza, so they can just bomb whatever they want. And they're targeting military infrastructure the whole time. But insofar as like Tanya's response and what she was getting at and what other doctors who've been interviewed by Western journalists have tried to emphasize is that these hospitals are functioning as hospitals. And what the Sky News anchor was insinuating is that there is a world in which justifying these hospitals that are functioning as hospitals is justified. And so like, it's completely a distraction, right? Like instead of talking about whether or not Israel's bombing hospitals, there's an assumption that it's justified. And Tanya's the one who has to kind of be put on the defensive instead of being able to talk about what she saw while she was working at these hospitals that are being targeted. And this in the setting of mass graves, right, that she had just seen. And this is like common across Gaza, where it's kind of like a whiplash. Like you expect to be talking about what you've borne witness to over however many days of horror you've accumulated. And then instead you're like put on this defensive positioning where you're not a witness or a doctor, but you're like a spokesperson for whether or not Palestinians have a right to receive medical care. And if they don't, it's already Hamas's fault. It's just like this insane game that like I said, distracts completely from what we're supposed to be talking about. And it's especially insulting for doctors who have held people in their hands as they died, have seen people's heads blow. It's incredible. Like the inhumanity that would allow a person to ask a doctor who's just come from Gaza to defend Palestinians' right to hospitals is just like mind-blowing. And then this just happens all the time.
Absolutely. And we kind of discussed this a little bit, but healthcare workers have been abducted, disappeared, tortured, maimed, killed, humiliated, subjected to sexualized abuses, etc. But you discuss in the article how, and I'm quoting here again, doctors and healthcare workers change out of their scrubs before leaving the hospital so as to not be targeted. And Tyan states that the systematic abductions, specifically those of healthcare workers, are severely underreported, claiming there have been at least 240 abductions that medical providers have themselves documented due to being underreported by the state. So if you can a bit, talk about what you have observed, what you've heard as to being the reason why healthcare workers are being systematically targeted by this Zionist state of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, very simply, Israel is a necro-political regime committed to not just like the mass death of Palestinians, but really having control over who lives and dies in Palestine, right? Like it has to have total control over the Palestinian body from birth until death. And if Palestinians, because assertion over our own selves as like even just like physical bodies is the beginning of like control over our lives. And so the way that like you quell resistance at its root is to prevent people from having control over their bodies. And like a doctor is an instrument of life. How does a system committed to the death of a people put a stop to life? They have to target all sources of life and all ways of maintaining life. And like the doctors, I mean, it's so obvious. Of course you kill the doctors. If you're trying to kill the people, you have to kill the people that are keeping them alive against the will of Israel. And like doctors are in that way like a final barrier and like a way of resisting in like a very visceral way what Israel's committed to. And then also doctors hold like a certain social currency that transcends, in theory, it doesn't actually materialize like this, but like it's supposed to transcend politics because we treat all comers. Whether or not there are Israelis in the hospitals in Gaza, a doctor in Gaza would treat all patients. That's like part of the oath that we take. And so there's like a currency when a doctor is testifying to what they've seen. Because while a lot of these Western reporters have on doctors to speak, and a lot of the essays being written about Gaza are coming from doctors because somehow the doctorness, the universalizing factor of the doctor comes before sort of like the specific national identity that would make them quote unquote biased, you know? And so they're like specifically threatening to Israel in all those ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really interested in your answer on, because you are a surgical resident, but yeah, Israeli forces have targeted doctors with the most experience, leaving behind junior attendings, residents, medical students, etc., who, as you mentioned, are then asked to take on responsibilities far beyond their training. Dr. Haji-san added that, and I'm quoting here again, seeing doctors and experienced medical personnel due to being targeted flee the region. So to discuss a bit how she narrates how this has affected the quality of care and the functioning of the medical facilities.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a number of ways that doctors in Gaza are targeted by Israel. And then there are a lot of senior doctors who have the means of leaving because they've worked for a long time, they have savings, who leave, who are able to secure work elsewhere or have family elsewhere, and they leave Gaza. And so what you're left with in a lot of these hospitals is, I mean, people like me who have really like no experience calling the shots, and people even with less experience, like early, like first year, second year medical students, who are being asked to carry out tasks that they are like truly not qualified to be handling. I mean, I'm sure that they learn on the ground, but it's a crippling of a medical infrastructure by literal targeting, by killing the doctors who run the medical system, and then by eliminating in other ways the people who are most qualified to train like people in this system. And so Israel is not only like crippling the medical system at present, but these trainees won't have doctors to train them in the future. I mean, I imagine that a lot of these doctors will come back, inshallah, once there's a ceasefire, but it's a much more like long-term destruction of a medical system. And the Israelis know this.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that answer. And I appreciate you so much for taking the time to talk with me about multiple of your articles. I know I've had you here for quite a while, but before I let you go, I really want to give you the opportunity to tell folks where they can find you, maybe shout out any of the work that you're working on, or anything that just where folks can find your work in general, and also just find you on social media.
Yeah, they can find me at just my first and last name on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll probably like post what I'm working on there. Although who knows, because of residency, I like probably won't have a lot of time to be like thinking and writing, but I'm gonna keep trying my best.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time. This was great. I think people are really going to resonate with it for sure.
Thank you, Josh.